Before we jump into the basics of groups and toggles, I wanted to go over the inspiration for this script. I was working on a project. I had two characters. Each character is in its own pre-comp, and they had to hand off an object from one to another, and the object had to be integrated within the layers, meaning that the object had to look like it was between their hand and their leg. The object could not be in the bottom of the stack so that it looked like it was behind them. And I couldn't have it on top of the two pre-comps because then it would just look like it was on top. So how could I do that and keep things procedural? So I came up with a method to be able to break these pre-comps into groups so that I could isolate them in the main comp. So looking at the render here, you can see how I broke those characters up into groups to allow that to happen. Let's take a look at the basics of groups and toggles. With groups and toggles, you can have 6 groups and 6 toggles. So let's start by looking at groups. To assign a layer to a group, all we have to do is select the layer and click on one of these 3 icons. So the first icon, the triangle, is group 1, group 2, and group 3. To get to group 4, we hold down Shift, and the triangle, that's group 4. Shift in the circle, that's group 5. Shift in the square, that's group 6. So with this text layer selected, I'm going to go ahead and assign that to group 1. We get some markers, so we get a marker identifying that this layer is part of group 1. And then we have GA01 on the rest of the layer because on those we get an effect applied. It's group 1, this is group assistant. And so this uses the transform effect. We have an expression on the opacity here. I did this so that if you have expressions on the main transform opacity property, it doesn't interfere with that. Okay, so let's go ahead and apply group 2 text to group 2, group 3 to group 3. Now, I've been doing just single layers. Let's go ahead and do group 4 by holding Shift. I have a circle and text here for group 5 that I want to add, so I'm going to hold Shift and click on the circle. And then let's go ahead and add these 2 last layers to group 6 by holding Shift and clicking on the square. Okay, so one thing you might notice in the Essential Graphics panel is I have these toggles for each of my groups. And that's going to come into play once we pre-compose to this. So let's go ahead and pre-compose this. So now that we've pre-composed, let's go ahead and look at the essential properties. And if I want to isolate just one of these layers, if I only want group 6, I can turn that on, and I have group 6. If I just want group 5, and so on. But this probably isn't very practical if you want to see all your layers. So how do we get around that? We select all of our groups, and this button here is called Extract, and is what it's going to do. It's going to create a layer for each one of the groups. So now I can turn off original comp, and if I solo group 1, we had just group 1 and group 2 and all the way up the stack here. Okay, so now if I want to add additional elements to this, maybe I want to add a square, really nice graphic here, but now this should be between group 3 and 4. And you can start to get the idea how we can reorganize these layers even though they're all part of a pre-comp. And that makes it really nice. We can go back, make changes to the pre-comp, and all these groups here are going to update, keeping our animation procedural and allows some flexibility in restacking, reordering layers, even though we have to pre-comp sometimes. If I want to apply group 1 to this rectangle, it's just right here. Let's go ahead and apply that to group 1. If I want to make a change to group 1, let's say now I want to also add this circle to group 1 as well. We can see that just the rectangle here is in group 1. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the triangle to add it to group 1. Now we have a couple options here. Do we want to overwrite the group? If I say yes, group 1 will be assigned to the circle and everything else will be removed. So let's go ahead and just try that. So now group 1 is only made up of the circle. So I'm going to undo. If I go back and apply it and I say no, group 1 is going to be made up of the rectangle and our new selection. So I'll say no, and so now group 1 consists of both those layers. Let's take a look at some of the other options here at the bottom of groups and toggles. So we have some checkboxes that are on by default. I've turned them off so we can take a look at what they do. So if I want to isolate this circle right here, I can go ahead and apply that to group 1. Now, if I come up here to the Essential Graphics panel and toggle my group 1, we can see that this triangle is still visible even though it's not part of group 1. If we look at the triangle down here, it did not get a marker on there, and that's because that layer is locked. So that can cause problems, especially when I'm working with character animation. I have a lot of layers. Sometimes I'm locking things out, and if I've forgotten that something is locked and I want it to still get that effect applied so I can isolate group 1, then that's what this locked is for. So let's go ahead and come back to the circle. Now, in order to remove a group, I'm going to hold down Alt and click on the triangle, and it's going to remove group 1. Now, let's go ahead and click on circle again. I have locked selected. I'm going to apply group 1. And now when I come up here to the Essential Graphics panel and toggle it, it works as expected. Okay? So that locked checkbox, all it's going to do is allow markers and that transform effect to be applied to locked layers. Now I'm going to hold down Alt and remove group 1. Let's take a look at mats. So this layer right here, the square, has a mat applied to it. And if I apply that to group 1, and if we come up here and toggle it, we can see that the mat is not taken into account. That might be what you want, but typically most people probably want the mat to be applied to it as well. So let me go ahead and hold down Alt and remove group 1. And now if I turn on mats, and if I only select the square, it's going to automatically select the circle mat as part of the group. So let me apply that to group 1. And now if we come up here and toggle, we can see that we have our layer with the mat applied. So that's what the mats does, automatically applies your mat to the group of interest. Okay? So let's go ahead and remove that. And then we have match. So what match does is when effects are applied to the Essential Graphics panel up here, match will make sure that the template name up here where it says name matches your comp name. Now, I like doing that. It helps things stay nice and organized. But if you've named your templates up here to a specific name and you don't want that overwritten, just uncheck that and you'll be good to go. Okay, let's take a look at toggles and see how they're different than groups. So I'm just going to select the drop down here, put it on toggle. I can select a layer of interest, so I selected this square here, and the controls are the same as with groups, but now we're just applying toggles. So I'm going to go ahead and assign that layer to toggle 1. And if I come up here to the Essential Graphics panel and toggle it, it just toggles that layer or groups of layers on and off. Okay, so I can come here to the circle and triangle and apply toggle number 2. And those layers will just go on and off. Now if I pre-compose this, and come down to the essential properties, we can extract those just like we did before with the groups. I'll turn off the main comp. We can solo toggle 1, and then we can solo toggle 2. Okay, so this is a great way to break up layers in a little bit different way. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Let's look at how we might use groups and toggles together for a specific outcome. So in this case, I'm going to select the circle, and I'm going to apply that to group 1. So we can see that we have just the circle. Now, I'm also going to, on this circle, apply that to toggle 1. So now I can turn the circle on and off, or I can isolate this circle. So let's go ahead and pre-compose this. Let's come down to the essential properties, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select on group, not the toggle, but just the group, and I'm going to go ahead and extract that. So let's turn off our main comp. So for group 1, we have just the circle. And then down here on my main comp, I have all 3 elements still. But with toggle, I can just turn that circle off. And so now I have the circle on one layer, and I have the other 2 elements on another. So depending on the situation, you might want to use just groups, maybe just toggles, or a combination of groups and toggles to get the results you want. Let's take a look at using groups with adjustment layers because they're a special circumstance. If I click on square and apply that to group 1, all the other layers get the transform effect so that we can apply an expression to opacity. And so that allows us to be able to isolate just a square, and so I can turn that on and off. The problem is that if we apply the transform effect to an adjustment layer, it's going to make everything underneath of it disappear. So that doesn't really work. So adjustment layers cannot be added to groups. Okay, the script is written so that it will ignore adjustment layers. They can be added to toggles. So before I do that, let me just come over here to circle, and I'm going to apply that to group 2. Triangle, I'm going to apply to group 3. And then my turbulent displays, right, that's making us have some warped edges here, I'm going to go ahead and apply that to toggle number 1. Okay, so how can we actually utilize this? So let me go ahead and pre-compose this. And I'm going to expose my groups. Now I'm not going to include toggle, I'm going to leave toggle out, but I'm going to go ahead and extract those. And so I can turn off my main comp here. So now we have, we'll solo this, we have our square, we have our circle, and we have triangle. Now, how can we actually use that toggle on the adjustment layer? Well, if I come over here to essential properties, and if I come here to toggle, I can turn now that adjustment layer off just for the square. If I come up here, we have a toggle for the circle. And so now I'm able to turn that adjustment layer on and off for individual layers from our pre-comp. Let's take a look at one more option within groups and toggles. So here I have 2 groups. Here's group 1 and group 2. So if I pre-compose this, I'm going to call this 0, 1. And if we take a look at the essential properties, we have access to our 2 groups. Piece of cake. I'm going to pre-compose this again. And if I had this on move all attributes into a new comp, let's go ahead and name this 0, 2. Move all attributes into a new comp, say OK. And I still have access, even though I've pre-composed again, I can still toggle those groups and I can still extract them if I want. I'm going to hit undo. So we're back to just the one pre-comp. I'm going to hit pre-compose again, and this time I'm going to choose leave all attributes in 0, 3 checkboxes. So in this main comp, and I'm going to say OK. Now, access to those groups is lost, and we cannot toggle them on and off. We can't do anything with them from this point. So if I open this comp, and where I do have access to the groups, I can highlight them. Now if I hover over the extract button, if I hold Alt, there's a tool called bridge. So I'm going to hold Alt and click the button, and we get this null called bridge. And in it, we're going to get, well, two effects. We're going to get a bridge 01 group 02, bridge 01 group 01. So that's going to allow us to be able to access that in the next comp. So if we go to our next comp, now we have access to those groups. It's called bridge because it's been bridged over to this comp. And now we still have access to it, and we could highlight those and extract them just like before, and we're good to go. Let's take a look at how groups and toggles can be used in compositing. So one of my favorite tools used for compositing is SuperComp from Red Giant. The problem is SuperComp doesn't work with 3D layers. So in this particular case here, I have this building, and I used the 3D camera tracker, and then I went ahead and added some different elements. So we have some window fire, we have smoke, we have more smoke, some fire, and then some fire in the window. And these are all 3D layers, and so if we try and utilize SuperComp with this, it's not going to work. So I took the different elements and I assigned them to different groups based off what type of element they are. And then if we look in the main comp, I went ahead and I'm going to turn off SuperComp, and we can look at this first group. This first group is just the building, and then this one's a little bit hard to see maybe, but this is the smoke, and then we have the fire elements, and then I have an additional fire element for in the window. And it looks not great right here because right now we do not have SuperComp turned on. But by breaking these up into different groups, we're able to maintain that pre-comp. So if I need to make changes, it works out really well. So I can turn on pre-comp, or I'm sorry, SuperComp here. I'll turn these off, and it looks pretty good. Now we could also go in here, and if we needed for some reason, let's go ahead and turn on this layer and solo it. If I needed access to just the fire to create another matte or another effect, I can certainly do that. Maybe if I needed to come in here and, not that layer, but if I needed just the smoke element, okay, it works out pretty well that I can access layers from that are pre-composed and still utilize them in the current comp. Groups and toggles also helps you embed mattes into MOGRTs so that when your MOGRT is used in Premiere Pro, you don't need separate files, you don't need separate comps for the matte, you can just embed it right into the comp. So if we take a look at this example here, we just have a simple wiggle transition coming on so that image A is the outside, and then image B we would transition to another image on the inside of the squiggle here. And the way that we can use groups and toggles is pretty simple. We have a toggle for the main graphic. If I turn that off, I have to turn the matte on. And so now, within the same comp, we have the ability to isolate just the matte. So it can be used in Premiere Pro. And then we also have to where they would have a second layer for the actual graphic. So in Premiere, that transition looks like this, right? So we just have two copies of the same comp. This comp here is our main graphic. So that's the part that we see. And then in track 4 here, we have just the matte enabled. And here we have the track matte effect applied so that it's utilizing track 4. And so now we have our one comp, but it's being utilized 2 times, one for the main graphic and one for the matte. Groups and toggles also makes it really easy to embed variations of your comp within the project. So here I just have a pretty simple graphic. Now I can embed a second version. I can just turn that on, and now this is going to toggle to the second version. All I did to do that was these layers here. Let's go ahead and solo them. These are part of group 1. And all I've done with this is make one group. Since I only have 2 different versions, I only need one group. And so this toggle here is going to isolate group 1, and it allows us to see the second variation. Now obviously you could have multiple variations within your comp and give your client or yourself some flexibility within Premiere Pro just by creating that really simple toggle to transition between different variations. And so in Premiere Pro, we just have a simple little toggle to enable version 2. We can just turn that on, and it makes it really nice to be able to switch between our different versions.